So, Matt Dickerson. I'm going to read a quick bio. Matthew Dickerson is professor of computer science at Middlebury College in Vermont, an internationally recognized scholar of fiction, of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Inklings. He is a novelist, a blues musician, a historian of music, a fly fisherman, a maple sugar farmer, and a beekeeper. Although Matt's creativity clearly has many facets, tonight we will be interviewing Matt as the author of both fantasy and nature writing. Matt, you have over 15 books published, or at least 15 at least, and the number of papers and articles basically runs over the hills and out of sight. So you're quite a prolific author, and I was kind of curious to ask you, how many words per minute can you type? Because
I took typing in high school, and I had taken 8 years of piano lessons prior to my, I think, junior year, maybe sophomore year of high school. Prior to that, so I was one of the fastest typists. Probably, I think I was actually the fastest in my high school class,
really,
and that has come in very handy
I will
as a
say,
writer. I know a lot of writers, a lot of authors they just like the feel of a pen on paper, and they really like to do that. And that drives me crazy because I am a very, very slow at writing. I never really learned handwriting. So when I write, I just print in big block letters, and my thoughts just go so much faster than I can write that I get frustrated, and words are missing, um, and I give up in like 20 minutes. So if it weren't for being able to type quickly, I would probably have given up being a writer.
interesting. Heading into the realm of fiction, and fantasy in particular, one of the questions that I wanted to start off with into our fantasy part of this interview was, what got you into fantasy? At what point did you realize, not only do I like this genre, but I think I might be good at it, and I want to try my hand at it?
Well, certainly my introduction to the genre of fantasy came in middle school, and maybe as early as fifth grade, reading the Chronicles of Narnia and The Hobbit, and that launched me into the Lord of the Rings, and then into many other well-written works of fantasy
At
literature.
what point did you decide that you want to be a fantasy writer?
Um, I actually started writing around my senior year of high school. I started writing a fantasy novel, and I worked on it for like 3 or 4 years, maybe throughout high school and throughout college. And I still have it someplace, printed on a dot matrix printer from the computer company I worked at in the early 1980s. It's really bad. But as I was writing it, I was developing as a writer.
Hmm.
And then I think in graduate school, I sort of gave it up. I realized that in college, when I was writing, it's really hard to work on a novel, because if you are full-time as a student and you can only come back to it every 10 or 11 days, by the time you come back to it, my train of thought would be lost. So if I had 2 hours to work, I'd spend the entire 2 hours rereading the last 60 pages. And so I wouldn't get any time to actually write anything new. So I turned my attention to short stories. And when I did that, the natural genre I fell into were short fairy tales and short science fiction stories,
Hmm.
largely inspired by George MacDonald. So I spent about 2 or 3 years writing short stories, mostly in the fairy tale or science fiction genre.
Did you get any of that published?
I didn't, but it was really interesting because I sent some of my fairy tales to an editor at Crossway Books, and he responded saying he really liked my fairy tales. He thought my writing was really good, but he said short stories simply don't sell well, and they definitely don't sell from unknown authors. It's very difficult to get short stories published unless you have you're either already well known as a novelist, or you have a history of getting them published in various journals. But he said, if I ever write a novel, send it to him, because he'd be very interested in it. So of course, that was one of those letters that you keep
Yes.
And I was really fortunate that about 2 years later, I started working on a novel in graduate school. It was a medieval historical novel based on a fragment of Beowulf. I finished the novel. I sent it to that editor, and he sent back. And with the first book I ever submitted, or second book, but the first time I ever submitted that particular work for publication, and it was accepted by the first person I sent it to.
Wow.
He asked me to do some rearranging and some rewriting in sections, but he really liked it, and that was published in 1991. Medieval historical work of medieval
Okay.
historical fiction.
Huh. I must have. So I met you not long after that then. So you were a newer author
That's right.
at that point.
Yes.
Okay.
It was 12 more years after that till I got my next book published.
Really? What were you
Yeah.
doing in those 12 years that sort of...
Writing and writing and writing and writing and writing and more writing.
So did you submit work during that time, but it wasn't accepted?
Yes, I got some rejections. I tried to start writing a fantasy novel, and some publishers I sent it to said, well, we're not interested in that, but we really like your medieval historical fiction. So
Okay.
if you write a sequel to that, we'd like to publish that.
Okay. But you wanted to do fantasy.
I was
So,
very much drawn to the fantasy genre. Yeah.
so did you stick with what was meaningful to you, or did you were you tempted to kind of go back to what would actually get published?
Well, by the time I went back to the sequel, the market for medieval historical fiction had collapsed. And so I went back to this to write the sequel, but more because it was more of that story I wanted to tell. And here's a little bit of a side note. That first novel got mostly very positive reviews. The only negative review it got that I ever read was from a journal of Christian libraries, or a journal that reviewed books for, I think, high schools and high school libraries. And they said the book did not have a redeeming ending, by which I think they meant it was tragic. It wasn't Christian-y enough for them. All my characters didn't become Christians at the end. Some of them got killed. And so they didn't understand it. And they didn't think it was, they said it's not appropriate for a high school reader because it didn't have a happy, redeeming ending.
Interesting.
And yet all the other readers, all the other reviewers, including a lot of secular reviewers, really liked it. They thought my characters were realistic, that the historical setting was well researched, and it was a well-told story.
Is that that attitude toward the lack of happy ending, is that something that you sort of battled within the context of the church throughout your career?
Yes, I think the modern church is often not comfortable with art, not comfortable with story and with metaphor, and often wants things explained and wants a recognizable label. They want to be able to slap a religious label to it, and then they think it's acceptable. And again, the metaphor, Elizabeth, you've heard me use before, would be like, if we had to take one of your beautiful paintings and then put a Bible verse or an inspirational saying in the bottom of it to suddenly make it worthwhile, as though the colors and the textures and the all the work that you put into the lines and everything didn't matter. What mattered is reducing it all to some message, and that message had better be a happy, inspirational one.
Yeah. What kind of fantasy do you have in store for us this evening? What excerpt? What are you taking the excerpt from?
Well, I only have one 3-volume fantasy novel published. I didn't set out to write a 3-volume novel. I set out to write one book, and then in 100,000 words, I realized that it wasn't going to finish at one book. So I said, all right, this had better be 2 books. And at 200,000 words, I thought, okay, this is not going to finish after 2 books. And at 300,000 words, the story was done. And so the publisher who took it made a 3-book novel out of it. Okay.
When was the last one published?
I think about 2.5 or 3 years ago, since the third one came out. So the books are titled The Gifted, The Betrayed, and Ill and Gone, but it's really just one one book broken into three volumes.
Do you have another work of fantasy up your sleeve?
Yes, I am currently working on. I actually have two. One's in the back burner, which was a sequel to this one, but this didn't sell well enough to suddenly demand a sequel. So I have another work that I'm much more excited about that's very active right now. I think of it as a sort of a work of echo fantasy, which sort of connects to the second half of my tonight. So here's a passage from The Gifted, and you can ask questions about it if you want. And I can't give you, it'd take me, this is around page 125, so it'd take me 125 pages to actually give you all the background.
Okay.
To bring you up to this point. After some time, they passed the highest level of the village, and there were no more places to rest. The constancy of the surrounding stone might have felt more oppressive had it not been for a series of stone paintings, mosaics, and engravings adorning the way. They were part of a continuing history of the village, Kathleen explained. There were a variety of styles among different artists working in different eras and in different mediums, and yet it still possessed a certain continuity. I have not yet learned all this history, Kathleen confessed, but my grandfather comes here to study and meditate. I like to come with him and listen and look and talk. I don't think even he, though he is wisest of our elders in many generations, understands all this story. He will ask me questions about what I think, or more often simply about how the art makes me feel. She stopped and paused before a striking mosaic of small, brightly colored pebbles. It depicted a yurt herd standing by a river. My grandfather's questions, I think, are intended to teach me, but I believe he himself continues to learn, and he listens carefully to my answers. Elena, glad for a moment to rest her legs, nodded as she stood next to Kathleen and admired the mosaics. She had been too occupied by the climb to pay much attention to the murals or attempt to follow the thread of story they told. But when Kathleen started forward again a moment later, Elena made the effort to pay more attention to the art. Now and then a particularly fascinating scene captured her attention, or else Kathleen would pause and explain some important character. In one large mural, a huge winged creature flew in the distant background. There were dark clouds around it. In the foreground, angry Chidani warriors shaking spears. Elena stopped and looked twice. She shivered and wondered aloud if she was looking at the depiction of the daemon. I cannot answer, Kathleen admitted. This one is very old, and I know little about it. Perhaps my grandfather can tell you. Several works, elaborate painted murals, tapestries, simple drawings of shapes and mosaics alike, had some depiction of Mount Illingond with its distinctive circular crown of 3 peaks. Some showed it from far away, its great mass towering over the landscape. Others depicted only the crown rising above the snow and clouds. In many of the latter images, the peaks surrounded a hollow bowl. Elena wondered how the artist knew to draw the mountain that way if nobody had ever actually looked in. Perhaps the bowl was just in the imagination of viewers, though the clouds that nearly always settled within the 3 peaks did seem to hold in some sort of a hollow. And all in there is a short reading. Since we got a little bit of a late start. I think for me, it's important. So as a side note, when this book got accepted by the publisher, who had a few other fantasy novels in the series, they hired an external reader to do some development, to sort of edit it and make suggestions for me on how to improve it. And the external reader they hired didn't like it at all. There were several things I had done. She said, "Oh, no, you can't do that. You have to change that completely." She said, "But you can't do that in writing." And I stopped for a moment and I thought of several writers who had done the exact same thing. And I pointed out several passages in Tolkien where Tolkien had done the same thing. And this external reader, this editor, said, "Oh, yeah, but if Tolkien were publishing today, if Tolkien were writing today, he wouldn't sell. You can't do what he does. She said, I need you to make it more like Game of Thrones. If you want it to sell, you need to make it more like Game of Thrones. So over and over again in her notes on my manuscript, she kept coming back. She'd say, read Game of Thrones, make it more like Game of Thrones, over and over again. That was her refrain as she was editing his books. For example, she really didn't like the descriptive passages like what I just read. And at some level, I think she's probably right that if I wanted it to sell, I would have maybe imitated that other, the popularity of Game of Thrones. But I think that's probably one of many places where as a writer of Christian faith, that wasn't my goal. Like, being a writer of Christian faith does not mean I want my stories to be preachy. It doesn't mean that I have some message I'm trying to get across. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to communicate religion through my stories. But it impacts me in a lot of other ways. And one of the ways is that I want, for example, even within my stories, to value art, to say something about how you can understand a culture through its art, and that a culture that values art is a wiser culture. So those were some of the ways that I sort of dug in my heels, and I would rather not have the book sell well or not have it even accepted for publication if that would mean for me compromising the very things that were important to me in writing the book in the first place. If the refrain to make it sell or to get the publisher was repeatedly going and making it more like Game of Thrones, then I would rather scrap the book than continue that. In terms of the moral, my moral vision for what I did want to accomplish.
I think every artist at one point or another comes to a crossroads like that. And it's always interesting to see what people choose. But no matter who you are or what kind of work you're doing, there's always the choice between the masses and sort of what stands the test of time. And what is an authentic expression of the person who created it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start violating that, I think your road of creativity doesn't become lifelong.
By the way, I think that passage took place right about here in that map.
Oh,
you're following
cool.
along in the map behind you. It's right about there.
Very cool.
Right, somewhere in between there.
Very neat. I'm going to have to let you carry the nature writing element of this discussion.
I'm going to turn it over and see if anyone else actually has any questions that they would like to ask. And if you do, feel free to, don't just feel free to unmute yourself. It'll actually be a requirement that you unmute yourself if you have questions and you'd like me to hear them. Mr. Broderson, I see that hand.
Yes, actually, I do have a question for you, Matthew. And for those listening, I know Matthew. I've been with him in some of his research for his nonfiction. My question is, I know how much... Yeah, well, no, seriously, speaking to the guides about how much CFS in a river flow, things like that. Yeah. I've been aware of and impressed by the depth of your research. How much research did you do for these works of fiction? And so real research on real history, how does that play into your fiction?
So for my historical novel, I spent 2+ years of graduate school in medieval studies in Old English language and literature. I translated medieval poems. I read esoteric, abstract archaeology journals, like 7th century Frisian jewelry, a re-examination, or entire articles about one particular piece of jewelry they found at one particular burial site. So for the medieval historical work, the research, it really is in medieval literature, and which I translated, archaeology and history. And so it was fairly carefully rooted. And I remember one editor in my sequel, an acquisitions editor who ended up turning the sequel down. It later got published, but she turned it down. She said, "Oh, your story isn't accurate because you have your characters eating corn and they didn't have corn in Europe." And I wanted to correct her. I said, "No, actually, they don't have maize in Europe. we didn't have corn in North America. We call maize corn because corn was a grain that they grew in Europe. And just like we looked at bison and said, oh, there's buffalo. And we looked at char and we said, oh, those are trout, because they looked like European things. The closest European thing they had to maize was corn, but there was a European grain that they ate and fed to animals. And that's where you get the word corn. So it was carefully architecture. I mean, it's not because everything was perfect, but it was carefully researched. For the fantasy novel, research is a little different. I begin the novel, and what for me comes first and foremost are the characters. And so I probably get 2 chapters into the novel before I know what's important, who the characters are, some idea where the story's going. And then I actually pause and stop. And I would spend quite a bit of time making maps, thinking through the cultures and how the cultures are different, and working on language, working on a sort of synthetic history of this world. And that's necessary so that from there on, now once I get into the writing, there's some consistency in it. Now this map behind me is an artistic version that my son Mark made when he was a geography major at Middlebury College, taking actually a history of cartography course. But he made it from my original maps. And so it's not so much now in the fantasy novel that I want to be consistent with what 7th century Denmark was like, but I want it to be consistent with what my world is, so that the distances make sense and the landscape makes sense. So that's the sort of level of research that I would go into there. Any other questions? Well, I can turn, if we're interested, into the second part of this that I promised, which is connecting creative writing of my creative writing to another sort of, I don't know if you want to call it genre, or mode that I work in, which is narrative nonfiction. I might call it nature writing, but I think the style that I've developed really incorporates sort of 3 or 4 what I might describe as different trends in narrative nonfiction. Different trends that you can all find in, especially in American literature. My friend Bill McKibben, I think, has argued that there's really very, very few forms of literature that are unique or original to the United States and to American English. Most forms of literature that we have here, there may be wonderful writers in those forms, but they're forms that were really developed and came to maturity in other places. But he really thinks that the nature writing genre really came to maturity in this country and in this language. Not that there aren't great nature writers in other languages and in other parts of history, but there's something I think particular about the fact that when literature was maturing, that this was one of the few places with a lot of wilderness left. So I think my style weaves together what may I think of nature writing in a tradition like Thoreau, with explicit environmental writing, like you might see in someone like Annie Dillard or Bill McKibben, with outdoor writing, which is actually how I got into it, writing about outdoor sports and fly fishing, and then an element even of journalism as well. So I try to weave those elements together in my writing. This past weekend, I was supposed to be speaking at a big festival called the Calvin Festival of Faith and Writing. I had been asked about 13 months ago to speak at that, and I've been looking forward to that event for about a year. It's a huge a national event that a lot of my friends have gone to. Some people in my writing group have spoken at. I was very excited, and the talk I developed there was about why nature writing is important and a Christian approach to it. And so I'd been thinking a lot about that and preparing the talk that I won't be giving. And I think a title I came up for, I'm not even sure if that was ever published, was "Consider the Lilies." So that's a command that Jesus gives towards the end of his Sermon on the Mount. He says, consider the lilies. And I think, I love that moose picture that we all get to see now. We could also say, consider the moose. I think in the same way that there's a devaluing of art sometimes in elements of the Christian church, there's also a devaluing of nature, of literature, of metaphor, and even in Jesus's teaching or in the metaphoric teaching of the New Testament, we hear something like "consider the lilies," and we immediately want to jump to the meaning of that phrase. Jesus says, "Consider the lilies," and then he sort of gives a lesson that you might draw from considering the lilies, and that lesson about wealth and worry and anxiety is an important lesson. It's important teaching, and the metaphor that we might get from the lilies that would lead us to that leads us in a good direction. But I think too often we're too quick to sort of jump to the meaning or the rational meaning or the theological meaning and actually miss out on the actual command. We don't take literally, or we don't take seriously enough the command, "Consider the lilies." I think before we start jumping to all the meanings, we should actually take the time to do that. And there's a lot of reasons for that, a lot of things that I think are really important for me as a Christian who was drawn to the genre of nature writing. One of them is, if you want to get to know an artist, you spend time with that artist's works of art. Long before I began to read biographies of Tolkien or read his letters or study him critically, I had spent years and years reading his works carefully and thinking about his literature and developing, I think, a very deep understanding for what he was trying to accomplish. So when I finally started writing about Tolkien, I would discover in his letters him telling me things that I already knew and already understood about him from looking at his art, from looking at his literature. So I wasn't surprised to see many of the things that he said because I already had a deep understanding of him as an artist from his art. I think the same thing is clearly true if we want to understand the creator of the universe. Then we need to reflect on creation. In the same way that you understand an artist, you wouldn't go up and say, "Oh, I really care deeply about Paul Rogers," but then not spend any time looking at his photographs. Or to get back to Elizabeth, who is not with us anymore, to say, "Oh, I really care deeply about Elizabeth as an artist," but then never bother to look at any of her paintings. And so I think a big part of it is if you really want to understand your creator, then you need to spend time understanding that your creator is an artist. Your creator is a great poet, a great painter, a great sculptor. And to understand your artist, spend time in your artist's work of art, which is creation. Not just exploiting it, not exploiting it at all, not just going out and being entertained by it, but taking the time to reflect and ponder those great works of art. And so for me, to write about that is part of a spiritual discipline of writing about the artistry of a great artist, both as a way of, well, first, as I already said, as a way of getting to know that artist. But then there's a second element, which is, I think, that God created us to delight in him. That's a biblical concept that's often forgotten about today. I think we confuse delighting in something with exploiting it or consuming it. But delighting in something is very different than exploiting or consuming it. We delight in something for its own sake. And so this idea of delighting in creation is one of the ways that we honor the creator. C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald, two of the writers, and I would also say to some degree Tolkien as well, three of the writers who have influenced me the most deeply, were also writers who understood deeply this idea of the importance of delight and of delighting in a thing. For Tolkien and Lewis, often that's food or a good meal or a beautiful flower or a tree. And you see times in Tolkien's writing where the characters just stop and admire the beauty of a flower or the bark of a tree or the freshness of strawberries. And so again, a second element of writing about and pondering about creation, pondering nature, considering the lilies is knowing the artist, but a second is delighting in the artist's work of art. We delight in that art as a means of knowing and honoring the artist. So I think that's a good place to pause and see if there's any questions, and then I can also do a little reading from another one of my books. I guess I should have. I meant to share the screens as I did the earlier reading, but then I just ended up doing a short version of the reading rather than the long one since we got a late start, so I didn't share that screen. But I'm going to read a section of my book, The Voices of Rivers, that was set in Glacier National Park in 2017 when I was selected to be the artist in residence at Glacier National Park. And here's a few photos from that experience that'll get you into the reading. Morning, June 7, and the title of this little section, this essay is called "And the Power of Rivers." And the little text comes from a Wendell Berry essay called "A Native Hill." And the little subtitle of this section is called "Flung Like a Net Over the Hill." It is shortly after dawn on my first full day in Glacier National Park. I sit beside Upper McDonald Creek near the Avalanche Creek trailhead off the famous Going to the Sun Road a few miles upstream of Lake McDonald, where my cabin hides among cedars along the southeast shore. I'd like to have gone further up this road, further up the valley, closer to the sun, but the road is still closed to automobiles. Logan Pass remains buried from heavy winter snowfall. Though many more miles are open to bikers and hikers, there is no place to turn a car around beyond this point. Yesterday afternoon, when I arrived at the park to start my 4-week residence, the temperature was over 80 degrees. Another warm afternoon is in the forecast. The snow is melting quickly. I should be able to drive over Logan Pass before my residence comes to a close. I'm anticipating an early morning trip to the top to sit and write. For now, I'm content where I am. The fast melting snow means rivers are high and cold. The famous Flathead is a raging torrent where it races through nearby Columbia Falls. It looks like a kale smoothie in a blender with the blender still on. Judging from the submerged gravel bars and streamside trees, Upper McDonald Creek is also fuller and swifter than usual. When the midday summer sun shines down on the snow and ice, it will run even higher. Lifting my eyes from the glacier green tint of the river over darker greens of cedars and hemlocks lying on the far shore, I see a pair of towering granite peaks etched by snow. Mount Vaught is due west. Heaven's Peak is further to my right, to the northeast. Both reach nearly 9,000 feet above sea level. The spruce and pine creeping up their sides give way long before reaching the triangular spires. Only a few stray bushes and patches of grass, moss, or lichen bleed coloring the otherwise bare rock. Morning sunlight provides an even sharper contrast to the varying shades of gray and green, the white of snow and the black shadows of narrow crevices. I'm struck by the majesty of this park as I was late last night when I drove along Lake McDonald. The peaks radiate strength. They reflect the weight of glory. I am reminded of the words of the ancient Hebrew poet responsible for Psalm 95. In the familiar King James translation, the poem reads, "The strength of the hills is his also." I consider titling my essay, "The Strength of the Hills." I hesitate. These words are used so often as an epigraph that they're becoming almost cliche. They are etched in the side of Mead Chapel at Middlebury College, where I teach, some 2,000 miles east of here. Yet strength seems such a wonderful word to describe these mountains, and the peak to my right is named Heaven's Peak. I wonder if there's a missing apostrophe. And here, by the way, I'm going to take a pause from my reading. The name of this peak in Glacier National Park is Heaven's Peak with no apostrophe, just Heavens. But it's so in what I'm imagining in this next reading is an apostrophe before the S. Heaven's Peak is in the peak belonging to heaven. I wonder if there's a missing apostrophe. Was it supposed to be Heaven's Peak? Bill Yen's Pictorial History, Images of America, Glacier National Park, mentions that Marius Pass used to be named Maria's Pass. So I will now think of this iconic mountain as Heaven's Peak with the apostrophe, both in reference to that ancient Hebrew poet and because it makes more sense. I think also about my friend Eugene Peterson, who lives not far away in Flathead Lake. His back deck and office window look out over the lake towards this same range. An author and retired pastor, Peterson is most famous for his translation of the Bible known as The Message. Knowing how rooted he is in this part of Montana, I look up his translation of this psalm. It reads, "In one hand he holds deep caves and caverns, and the other hand grasps the high mountains." The high mountains, the strength of the mountains, the peaks of heaven. I imagine Peterson sitting in his office looking eastward towards these mountains as he translated. My thoughts, however, soon turned from the strength of the mountains to the powers of rivers. Wendell Berry, in his beautiful essay in Native Hill, speaks of the irresistible call of oceans that draw all waters across the earth. Underlying this country, 900 feet below the highest ridgetops, more than 400 feet below the surface of the river, is sea level. We seldom think of it here. We are a long way from the coast, and the sea is alien to us. And yet the attraction of sea level dwells in this country as an ideal dwells in a man's mind. All our rains go in search of it, and departing, they have carved this land in a shape that is fluid and falling. All waters are one. This is a reach of the sea, flung like a net over the hill and now drawn back to the sea. And as the sea is never raised from the earthly nets of fishermen, so the hill is never caught and pulled down by the watery net of the sea, but always a little of it is. Each of the gathering strands of the net carries back some of the hill melted in it. Sometimes, as now, it carries so little that the water flows clear. Sometimes it carries a lot and is brown and heavy with it. Whenever greedy or thoughtless men have lived on it, the hill has literally flowed out of their tracks and into the bottom of the sea. End quote. Wendell Berry wrote about the Kentucky hills and rain-swollen rivers, but his words are also true of these rugged Montana mountains and the snow and ice melting off them to make the torrent rage at my feet. Not 900, but 9,000 feet below the peaks, the Pacific calls. So do both the Hudson Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. Glacier National Park holds the only point in North America which water might flow to sea level in any of these locations. The park is aptly known as the crown of the continent. And I will stop there. I think the next passage I get to addresses my one sighting of this bird on my very first morning. And for the rest of my time there, I kept running into birders who would come to the park just to see this one bird that I stumbled on just 10 yards away from me on my first morning with very little understanding of how fortunate I was. Anyone recognize it? It's a male harlequin duck. And it just casually swam by me, just 8 or 10 yards away from my chair on my first morning there on the creek. And the interesting thing is the males only come to Glacier National Park for about 2 weeks. Like males of many species, they mate and then they leave and fly off and leave the females to raise the young, and they head off to Alaska. But the females and the young stay there much of the summer till the young can fly, and then they head to Alaska too. So I will stop sharing, and I am happy to end there and take questions if there are any about anything, or conversation, or responses, or thoughts. Just be sure to unmute yourself. Paul.
I do have a question for you.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, it actually relates back to the fantasy writing that you had done earlier. One thing you mentioned was that you haven't really taken much of an interest, I guess, if I understand you correctly, in writing the kinds of fiction that will present a moral lesson at the end, or teach something about the Christian view. And I wondered if you had ever spent much time giving that kind of purpose in your writing much thought.
So when I say that, what I should clarify, what I'm not interested in is starting with a moral lesson and trying to wrap a story around a moral lesson. Like the moral lesson becomes the purpose of the story. I'm interested in telling a good story with compelling characters that will flow at a much deeper level out of who I am, rather than have some of the 17th century fairy tales that would wrap everything up at the end with a little platitude.
Right.
So if you could reduce my story to a platitude or a moral lesson, then I feel like the story is not needed in the first place. So I didn't quite answer your question, but I wanted to clarify what I was saying briefly before I answered that.
Sure. So you don't start out then with an idea of a fantasy that is something that you're writing for perhaps a number of different purposes, but at least one of those purposes being to show a moral or
I don't have a moral or a lesson in mind when I do it. What I do have in mind is a desire to tell a good story, in particular, the desire to create real and compelling characters. Mm-hmm. So some of the reasons I think story is important is I think one of the biggest falsehoods or lies that prevails in our world today is the idea, and there are multiple related ideas, but that human beings are just accidental, meaningless byproducts of a meaningless universe. That the universe is a great cosmic accident, and we're just the meaningless byproducts of that great accident. Second, that we are all just complex biochemical machines. So I think one of the most important things I can do in story is, one, give value to all of our choices and all of our decisions, and show that our actions and our choices have consequence. And the second thing I want to do is value every human being, every person. And I want to write a story that accomplishes those two things. So even if someone didn't come out of it like with an understanding of the Christian gospel message or the resurrection of Jesus, which I probably, the latter of those I probably wouldn't try to touch on in a fantasy story anyway. But if someone comes out of it with the deeper sense that all human beings are, all created beings are valuable, have meaning, that our lives have meaning, that the universe is not an accident, and that our choices matter, then I feel like I've accomplished something. There's a couple other goals I always have in my writing also, which is, I think, we are a world that is in desperate need of heroic figures that we want to emulate. And I think in old failure, or the failure maybe in some writing that might be too trite or moralistic, would be trying to provide a hero who is not realistic, who's perfect, or who isn't human. I don't know if that makes sense. Like like unbelievable heroes, unrealistic heroes. But I think the opposite thing that so much modern writing and so much modern television is drawn to now is complete cynicism. I'm so appalled now by so many glimpses I get of so much television that seems to glorify evil. The main characters, the main protagonists of the show are just really unkind. They are selfish. They're self-seeking, and they're the protagonists. They're in some sense the heroes of the show. Even like cooking shows will often like glorify the head character just being really mean to everybody. And then people emulate that. So another thing I want, and I think fantasy literature can provide this especially well, is characters who are sort of not the subjects of cynicism, characters who really are heroic that you can emulate, that I think are modeling virtue, but also who are real, who are not perfect, who have doubts, who have struggles, who fall at times. So that's also one of my goals. I think having those sort of literary characters that we can aspire to, who can move us or motivate us in life's difficult situations, I think is a real value that I try to provide in literature. There's other things, like I deeply believe that the world is created. So it would be impossible for me to write a work of fantasy set in any realm, no matter how imaginary the realm would be, in which that realm was an accidental product of meaningless choice. So again, I'm writing out of who I am, that my created worlds are places of meaning, places where our choices have meaning, places where the people have meaning, and places where there is real, I want to say, objective moral goodness. There are things that are right, and there are things that are wrong. It's not even so much that there's a particular moral lesson I want to give, as much as the sort of meta moral lesson that morality is even a category worth discussing. I think so many readers today, before you could even get them to think about a particular moral lesson, they don't even believe in the whole concept of morality.
Right.
So if I can write a fantasy world in which not only do I make moral virtue heroic, which is something I think one of my favorite writers, Dick Keyes, mentioned in his book Beyond Identity, the importance of that. I want to make moral virtue heroic, but I also want to make just the idea that there's such a thing as a hero and that there's such a thing as moral virtue believable and real to readers. So maybe that's the deeper answer to the question you might have been asking.
Yeah.
But I have a trick as a speaker, which is answer the question I can answer rather than the one that's actually being asked.
Yeah, good.
Paul?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. Regarding nature writing, we've all had experiences in nature where there were details, things we experienced and we may have observed and taken note of, which sometimes people don't. But when it comes to writing, how we remember those things with a freshness and a detail before those details fly away. So my question is, what role does note-taking and actually writing in nature, which I guess painter would liken to plein air, which is done right there, how much of that is done in the field? How much of it is done soon after? And is it possible to patch it later on, which I found very hard to do when I've tried?
No, there's absolutely a mix for me. When I was artist in residence at Glacier National Park, then the next year, 2018, I was artist in residence at Acadia National Park, and I've also gone to Alaska, specifically to Lake Clark National Park, to write. A typical day for me at Glacier would be to get up sometimes before breakfast, or sometimes eating a really early breakfast, and spend 4 hours outside. And I might spend 30 or 45 minutes walking someplace. And then I would set up my little backpacking chair, get out my iPad or my laptop, and I would sit and write. And I would write, well, actually, I would usually sit and be quiet for half an hour. So I wouldn't pull out any writing utensil at all. I would sit on my chair, fold my hands. Often in June, it was 30 to 40 degrees in the morning. So I would maybe, put on my gloves and put on a hat and wrap a blanket around me or something. But I'd be sitting out in the middle of no place, and I would just listen and I would observe. And before I did any writing at all, I would pay attention to, what do I hear? What do I see? What do I smell? What's moving? What's still? Paying attention to the creak of trees and the rustle of leaves in the ground and in the wind, and what birds can I hear. Then I would pull out something to write on. Depending on how far I was going, I might actually pack my laptop in, or I might just bring my iPad in if I wanted something smaller. And I would sit and write for about 2 hours. I would not try to produce a polished essay. I would just take notes and write observations, and I would write in complete sentences. Sometimes I just have little notes like I see this or I see this. But often I was writing in complete sentences, but not trying to have polished prose. And writing as much as I could. And then I would also take pictures, thousands of photos I took in Glacier National Park. And then typically go home, go back to my artist cabin, get lunch, and then I'd often spend the afternoon then polishing, filling in the details, trusting my memory to remember things, and sometimes pull out like a photo. Like I might not have realized I wanted to write about the Harlequin duck. Like I didn't realize I wanted to write about a Harlequin duck when I was on the stream until the next day when I was at park headquarters and kept bumping into people who had really wanted to see this duck, and there I saw it on the very first morning. So then I realized, okay, I have to describe this duck, and that wasn't the thing I was paying attention to. I was paying attention to the transition up the mountains of cedar to spruce to moss and lichen to bare rock, or I was paying attention to the way the sunlight moved down the mountains. I was paying attention to the tint of the water. But then I realized, oh, you know what? I really want to write about that duck. And, as you can see, this is just a fraction of the duck photos that I took.
Right.
And I'm ashamed to show these to a professional photographer, so, but I wasn't taking them to be artistic. I was often taking photos that could prompt my memory later.
Right.
If there's something like I hadn't observed, and then later on I thought, there was some really interesting trees. What were they? 10 minutes after the Harlequin duck came by, this beaver came by. And because the river was flowing really high, about 3 days later, it would be 10 feet higher than this when the snow really began to melt. But even on that morning, it was pretty high. So the beaver had to swim right against the shoreline to make it upstream, which meant that beaver was really close to me and just puttered up. And I got some photos of the Harlequin taking off. And so again, I was able to go back and look at that and refresh my memory, because I remember thinking he didn't really look like he was built for flying. He looked much more comfortable in the water, bobbing up and down, than he did flying.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I would rely on notes I took firsthand, as well as try to do things later that day while it was still fresh, to sometimes going back a day or two later, like trying to identify birds. So a mix of all the above.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all then. I would apologize to everybody on Facebook for not getting the streaming out to you, but they wouldn't hear me anyway. Well, thank you again. I'm going to stop my recording.